You know, money, as you all know, makes the world go round, certainly impacts Washington, D.C. And the conversations around money are also about the bank, but they're also centering around Ukraine policy as well, and the idea of what level of support, the duration of support, the amount of support, and what form it takes. And there is some tension now growing among the Republican Party about how to do that. Listen to this. I mean, there was this growing backlash against Governor Ron DeSantis now about the comments that he has made recently. And just today, former Vice President Mike Pence weighed in on all of it. Listen to what he had to say.
Well, look, the war going on in Ukraine right now is not a territorial dispute. It is a result of an unprovoked war of aggression by Russia. I strongly support continuing to provide the Ukrainian military the resources necessary to repel that Russian invasion.
Now, I know no group's a monolith, right? But who do you think is more in line with the feelings of the base? DeSantis or what Pence is saying?
I think Pence. I think that's going to be the big question is there's a shadow primary happening in the GOP between what I would call the Reaganism wing and the Trumpism wing. And Reagan isn't just an appeal to the 1980s figure. It's a way of thinking about conservatism. And Republicans, conservatives traditionally have not been in favor of Russian aggression. And I think that will, what DeSantis is trying to do is balance these factions between the Reagan faction, and he's really a Reaganite at heart, pretending to be a Trumper.
DeSantis.
And DeSantis is, right, DeSantis is. And so he thinks he's going to bring these together, but more likely those forces will pull him apart as a candidate if he tries to straddle this. And it hurts his brand because he's trying to run as an outsider, which all politicians do these days. And he sounds like a politician, DeSantis does. He's trying to play all sides of this, whereas Pence and Haley have a more consistent, coherent message. So I don't think it's going to work well for him.
You know, you mentioned the idea of pretending to be a Trumper. You have a great piece out, and I want to quote part of it in your Atlantic headline. You say, vengeance is Trump's. The former president is threatening retribution. What we need instead is forbearance. And I want to go on a little bit. It says, since the Trump era began, we've seen a particularly toxic mix of passions on the right, fear and desperation, anger and indignation, feelings of betrayal and victimhood, all of which cry out for vengeance. Whether the nominee is DeSantis, who bills himself as a God-given protector and a fighter, or Trump, or someone else, the MAGA wing of the Republican Party will demand that the leader of the GOP seek vengeance in its name. Donald Trump has energized a movement and a propaganda infrastructure that will outlast him. You certainly don't mince words, Peter. Explain why you think vengeance might be a part of the campaign trail now.
Well, because it's central to Donald Trump, and this is a Trumpified party. It's a MAGAfied party. These elements, these sensibilities, these dispositions existed before Trump came, but he was superb in tapping into them and then amplifying it. Look, Trump is not a figure that can be understood in terms of his public policy. He didn't have any. He has no interest in the idea side of politics. He's a visceral politician, and he embodies what I think are these resentments and grievances. And unfortunately, I think they've grown actually since Trump has left. Trump is less powerful and less influential and less popular in the party than he was. That was inevitable once he left office, but he's still more powerful than anybody else. And I do think, if you look at the polls, it's Trump and DeSantis, and they have that same temperament, that same approach. I think what DeSantis is going to do is he's going to try and outflank Trump by using the power of the government to prosecute the culture wars. So I think the Republican Party is still in a very bad place. And when you're driven by vengeance, that's a dangerous thing for a party and for a country.
Interestingly enough, I mean, the idea, Trump is saying that DeSantis is actually copying him when it comes to Ukraine. So there are some, and although, remind people, he has not formally announced he's actually running for the presidency, and yet everyone thinks the governor of Florida really is. I want to play for you what Republican senators are saying about Governor DeSantis' comments on Ukraine, and they're not siding with him. Listen to this.
The majority opinion among Senate Republicans is that the United States has a vital national security interest there in stopping Russian aggression.
I think this is a much bigger issue than a territorial dispute.
I believe it's very much in the interest of America to honor our word.
I can't imagine what Xi Jinping or or the leadership in Iran would think if we took that course of action.
To say this doesn't matter is to say that war crimes don't matter.
I personally believe that I'd rather help Ukraine win the war quickly than help them win it slowly or perhaps, lose it slowly.
So, James, we haven't heard this sort of approach to DeSantis in a long time, if ever, at this point in time, certainly not now. Is this something they're seizing on, you think, as a way of signaling, look, you're not the guy, too?
Well, this is his real debut on the national stage talking about foreign policy, and I hate to say it, but he stepped in it. I think most Americans, regardless of what you think about whether the United States should be providing economic or military assistance to Ukraine, know that this was a one-sided, unprovoked invasion of a sovereign country. It's not a territorial dispute. Those words are going to come back and haunt him. The dispute in the Republican Party right now is, do we spend the kind of money we've been spending on military aid to Ukraine, not whether Putin is the right, foreign leader to emulate or to implicitly praise. So I think DeSantis is going to come back and regret these words.
That's fascinating because, as your point, the idea of if he's winning, so to speak, on the attention related to culture wars and the philosophical disputes that are happening, he talked about the philosophical as opposed to the brass tacks in this particular instance. I wonder how it'll all come down in the end.